Welcome back to the Denver Film Festival. Hope you enjoyed your screening. I'm Joe Fassler. I'm deputy editor of The Counter. We're a nonprofit newsroom covering the world of American food. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Liz Marshall, the filmmaker behind the movie you just saw. She's a Canadian filmmaker, and Meet the Future was her fourth feature-length documentary. She's been active in the industry since the 90s, and her first feature-length documentary was The Ghosts in Our Machine, which really got into the world of industrial meat production, which is a sort of player in the film you've just seen. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. So, Liz, it's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well, Joe.
And I guess I'm curious to start with, why did you want to tell this specific story? Obviously, there's fascinating sort of science fictional elements to it, but what drew you to the world of not just meat alternatives and environmental meat issues, but specifically this question of, can we simulate real, actual biological meat?
Great question. And the motivator for me and why I made this is because I was really seeking an active, unfolding, and character-driven story back in 2016 that is solution-focused. Because I've made a lot of documentaries around the globe, as you mentioned, since the late 90s, that have focused on all kinds of social justice and environmental and animal themes. And there's a lot of despair out there. There's a lot of gravity around many things that are urgent, critical, timely, and depressing, frankly. And so I was really seeking a story that could offer something that is perhaps more upbeat, that has a solution attached to it. And so this concept, this huge idea of growing real meat from animal cells is something that not only could potentially change how meat gets to the plate, but it could also change how we think about food production in general. So it is potentially extremely transformational. And I'm interested in transformation. I like transformation. I believe in it. And so getting exclusive access to follow this story back in 2016, and then having that privilege to follow a story as it unfolds over 3.5 years, for any storyteller, for any filmmaker, that is something that is, of course, challenging, but lends itself to having a trajectory in the structure of how you put together a film. And it's exciting because it's an exclusive story. It's the only story in film that is out there in the world right now that's 90 minutes in length, that really is laser focused on this big idea.
Absolutely. I'm wondering how that your relationship to the subject matter may have changed over the years, and that in 2016 it was actually still pretty early in where these companies were as far as delivering a viable product. They're still not there, and certainly by 2016 there was buzz. There were news articles writing about Memphis Meats and Just Inc. and a lot of the other big players in the space, but they were earlier on. And so you've watched this really evolve and become closer and closer to reality. And, I'm not a filmmaker, but it strikes me that 3.5 years is a long time, to spend and sort of just a wonderful amount of time to really live with this material. And I'm just wondering how much you sensed that, wow, this field is changing. This may have been a pipe dream or closer to a pipe dream when I came in, with some perhaps very serious people behind it. But by the time the film's actually being released, you can almost sense this sense of possibility.
Yes. So back in 2016, when I had that shiver and that sort of instinct to pursue it, and then to secure the exclusive access that is required when you focus on a story such as this, and to make it character driven so that it's relatable and that it's humanized, and it's not just a freaky futuristic idea. It's not just theoretical, but it's actually focused on the humans, the people that are risking everything to bring their vision to the world.
Yeah.
So there was so much uncertainty because, of course, what a risk they are taking. And then, of course, myself as a documentary filmmaker, I was taking a huge risk because the Memphis Meats story, which is the startup that the film focuses on, they could have dissolved, they could have faded away into the ethers. Um, and that's not what happened at all. As you know, because you've seen the film and now you're watching this Q&A. Um, but there was that risk of investing myself, my time, and also trying to get financed by the film industry to make it a reality, that it just would turn into something that had no promise. Um, so I guess the best way to answer it is yes, back in 2016, it was absolutely relegated as frankenfood in the eyes of the general public. And I would say now, 2020, 4 years later, it's much more of a mainstream subject matter that is being seriously considered and accepted.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about your main character, Uma Valetti, who's co-founder of Memphis Meats. I'm curious about your selection of him as the main character. Was that always the case, and what drove that? I mean, part of it, may have been logistical. This company gave you access, but he obviously is a charismatic figure and certainly an interesting one. And I'd just love to hear a little bit about your relationship to him as a character and why he seemed like a suitable lens through which to view this material.
Well, it started there. It started with him because um, when you make a character-driven film, you have to have that sense that the person is worth following, that there's something about them that you believe in, that you feel that they could, um, you know, uh, occupy screen space in a film and be relatable or compelling. So it started there and we clicked. We had a number of conversations. I flew down from Toronto to the Bay Area in California to meet him and his small team. Actually, that's in the film because that's the first visit. And it was such a great milestone to be there when they had just moved into their first facility.
Yeah.
And so it was amazing to be there on the ground and to start the film with that. So it started with him, and he is an interesting person. I love the fact that there's a subtext in this film that is never directly talked about, and that is that he's a man of color. He's from India, and he immigrated to America as a young man, became a successful cardiologist who trained at the Mayo Clinic. And then he took a passion-driven, risky career turn in 2015 and co-founded Memphis Meats with his co-founder, Nicholas Genovese. Um, and I love the subtext of the immigration story and the person of color and all of that in light of so many issues, other issues in the world right now. So I think that Uma is interesting because he's very measured, he's highly intelligent, and he's very compassionate. And he's a good leader. And he's subtle. He's not over the top charismatic. He's not a showman. In fact, I would describe him as someone that is maybe a bit of an introvert, but he firmly believes in his vision, and the people around him believe in him. And that became increasingly clear as we were following the story. Like in 2017, the greatest sort of dramatic twist and turn is that that little company of Memphis Meats, a year later, after following them, Cargill and Tyson, two of the largest meat industry incumbents, invest in that company. And billionaire influencers, Richard Branson and Bill Gates, invest in that company because they believe in the company, but they believe in him. He's the CEO. Uma Valetti is the CEO. So it's also a story about the rise and prominence of a pioneer. That's, he's an innovator, he's a pioneer, he's a CEO. And so we see that trajectory as well in the film.
Yeah, and such amazing, timing, that shiver of insight that you had. You got there before the Bransons and the big VC firms. In a way, you're able to kind of chart that success, which is really cool. But one of the themes that comes up in his character, it's interesting because he obviously is such like a fundamentally decent, humble person, who's also a visionary and is trying to bring something into the world that hadn't existed before. And the film does, one of the way he becomes perhaps a slightly more complicated character, is you do get the sense that this has taken a toll on his family, to an extent. That he has a moment very early on where he almost sort of tears up when he thinks about the sacrifices he's made, as a parent, and that his family members has made for him to do this. And there's a couple exchanges between him and his spouse that are very, touching and poignant, and trying to figure out the work-life balance. And it seems like one aspect of what you were exploring is, the way that a vision can be kind of all-consuming, and really take a person's sort of full humanity, and why that can be so impactful, but also, it's just so much for that family unit to endure. And that was one of the aspects of the film I thought was really striking. And I was curious, it's sort of a nice counterbalance to some of the vast systemic issues we're talking about. It's just this man and his relationships.
And that is the heart of it in some ways. It's so important to humanize ideas. And so when people ask me, what is Meet the Future about? There's all these layers to it. On the greater layer, the greater higher level, it's about this great big transformative idea. And then, you bring it closer and closer, like you just did, and it's about, sacrifice, and it's about love and family and perseverance and vision and innovation. And so I will speak for myself, but I also know that my crew, also feel the same way, and that is that we were so deeply, moved and inspired by, Uma and Mrinalini, his, life partner, his wife, their ability to navigate, these big challenges, these big career shifts and challenges. And because she's a successful doctor herself, and they have two children, and yet they're together, and she's a big part of this big idea. And so I, as a woman filmmaker, it was very important to me that she was in this film, because I know that she provides, a level of stability, security, and like a backbone for him. And he's very forthright about that. He's always reminding everyone around him and us as the crew, as the filmmakers, of that reality. And so it was really important to me that that was included, as an integral part of his story. He's not a lone figure. We learn about all these successful men all the way through history, but we never learn about, you know, how they get to where they are. And he is always honoring his partner and his family, always. He also honors his team at Memphis Meets, tremendously. And so it was really important to the integrity of the story to include the team. Now, all of that poses all kinds of challenges when you're making a film, because then you're suddenly dealing with a cast of characters. And, outside of that sphere, there's also cast of characters in the external world. And there are other pioneers and innovators in this space. And so I was constantly trying to find that balance and that way to tell this story and not make it solely about Uma, because this idea is much bigger than Uma. Uma's a pivotal person within this movement, but he's certainly not the only person. So all these challenges when you make a film, so many important people, such an important community, and then of course, what is the pushback? What are the arguments? What are the risks? What is the controversy? And so trying to make sure that you integrate those voices as well, so that you give it not only dramatic tension, because it needs that, but it's also important in telling a story about a big idea that is being ushered into the world. Of course, there are differing opinions. Of course, there is, um, skepticism, right? So, yeah, it was a hard film to make, but all films are hard to make.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that was interesting to me about this film uh, is that I often think there's sort of two main veins of food media, and this is obviously speaking very generally, but one has to do with Upton Sinclair and the jungle, and it's the expose, it's the pull back the veil gesture. We're going to reveal the ugly truth, and then the other dominant vein is the Food Network. It's food as lifestyle, it's food as something to enjoy, it's about the preparation of food, it's about the way that food fits into culture. And this is the rare film to me that actually is has elements of both. It's
Mm.
there are moments where you're sort of dramatizing the environmental toll of food production and farming, but there's also a lot of eating, and moments of people ingesting food and thinking about it, and beautiful shots of meat cooking in a frying pan. And so I'm just interested, like, well, let's talk about both of those aspects of the film. First of all, there are some amazing cinematography around large sort of animal feedlots, and things of this nature that really get into the kind of the mechanistic nature of it, and sometimes the ravage. And I'm just curious, how did you approach that? Most of the film is not focused on that, so the pieces that do try to suggest the devastation there that can occur are have to be very powerful and working in a kind of very visceral shorthand. I'm just curious how you approach that element of the storytelling.
Well, let me ask you, do you think it is dramatic, that section?
Dramatic in what sense?
Did you find it dramatic?
In that I found it was not true, or that I found it like emotionally powerful.
Yeah,
The latter.
emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean,
Mm.
I'm a little bit different and not your target audience because I've seen a lot of these things up close as a food journalist. But I think that one of the benefits of film when it comes to this subject matter is this is, a lot of Americans do not necessarily have access to
The truth.
the industrial food system as it exists, and so
Exactly.
these images are very powerful, and are also rarely seen. And
Yes.
so I think to to be able to do that, and kind of show the not just the reality of it, but the kind of personality of it, and that it's big, it's sort of inhuman, it feels highly technologized. That is a gesture that I think can be powerful for audiences.
Okay, great. So I asked you that question because well, obviously that's the intention, is to have a dramatic effect, and to create that impact. But that's only within the first 20 minutes of the film, and it's a short sequence within that time space, um, because the goal is to, of course, make very clear what the problem is, and then move and pivot immediately from the problem into this potential solution and stay there. Um, it's not the kind of film that needed to go back to those images. And that was, again, just part of the complexity and the, the multitude of decision making that happens in an edit suite. Um, but the power of the images was incredibly important. So aerial shots, so drone cinematography to show scale, and to really allow those images to um, play out, so that you can not only get a sense of scale, but you can get a sense of, um, well, scale would be the correct word. Then after scale, to go into detail. So to go inside these industrial barns, um, and capture the reality of what's going on in there. And that sequence was, believe me, we labored over the tone, the images, the pacing, how long that sequence would be, whether or not to use music, whether or not to have anyone talking during that sequence. So, uh, there's no talking because there's no need to talk. What are you going to say? The images say it all. This is a filmmaking of its ability to move people through the gravity of image and sonic art form. So there's no need to provide a voiceover during that sequence. I tried various things, but it upstages. Also with music, there's no need to hit people over the head with a heavy-handed score. So there is music there, but it's subtle and it supports the tone, the message, the visual sequence itself. But really, that sequence is meant to uh, give you truth and then to move on from that.
Yeah. And were there any logistical challenges to I don't want to dwell on this because as you mentioned it is a kind of setup that helps dramatize what your characters are sort of working against. But were there any interesting sort of logistical challenges to obtaining that footage or actually documenting it in the first place that you think might be interesting to people?
Well, there's egg gag legislation in the US, in different states in the US. And lawyers, animal rights lawyers, are working hard, to defeat those bills. And they're also recently there's ag gag legislation in Canada as well. And what that means is that whistleblowers, or people working from within and see the truth, you can't film. Journalists can't take a camera and access these massive uh, operations, because they don't, you're not allowed. It's illegal. You can go to jail. You can pay enormous fines. So, um, from a legal standpoint, there's enough interest and public concern in the topic that legitimately allows me as a filmmaker to access those images. And so I can't really say exactly how we did that, but I can tell you that it was very important to the story that we tell the truth.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mentioned before that, that one kind of dominant vein of food media or food journalism is the sort of Upton Sinclair, the jungle, pulling back the veil. And you've sort of done that movie, The Ghost in the Machine, in Our Machine, your 2013 movie. It's more about the fur industry than food production, but it does kind of say, like, here's the ugly thing that you aren't seeing, and confronting the viewer with it. So much of this film is not that movie, and I'm wondering how, for you as a filmmaker, it felt to be filming the act of eating, the act of food preparation, the thought that goes into it, that moment when a taste or flavor might register across somebody's facial expression. How did that feel to be a subject for the first time, and how did you approach those sort of smaller, more intimate human moments as a filmmaker?
Yes, so I love character-driven storytelling. That's what I do. And with this, I knew that I needed Uma, his team, his family to humanize this big idea. But we also needed to make real the big idea. And making real means showing it as food, because that's what they're doing. They're innovating meat. They're innovating real meat, getting to the plate in a dramatically revolutionary kind of way. Eliminating the need to breed, raise, and slaughter billions of animals, um, building from the cell up as opposed to from the animal down. Those are big, huge concepts that are science based or technology based or theoretical or science fiction or whatever. And so it's important to the storytelling to see this as food and to experience, um, you know, how does it cook? How does it look? How does it taste? How is it being received and experienced um, as food? And so that was essential. And, um, I would say it was well, stepping way back, like, everyone needs protein. We can't survive without protein. Um, and so the world is changing. And there's even interesting discussion now about rebranding the meat aisle as the protein aisle, which is smart. And it's about time because there's many ways that we can get protein. It's not all from animal-based meat. That said, um, the discussion around the next agricultural revolution, the discussion around the modernization of animal agriculture or meat, because there's also plant-based meat, of course, which you know all about as well. Um, we need to look at this in a visionary kind of way because it is visionary, but we also need to look at it in a pragmatic way. 90% of the planet at least eats meat. Um, vegetarianism and veganism is still a small, um, minority in the world. So uh, I was just really curious, excited, and keen to create a film that is showing this innovation at its infancy, because this is really the birth of an industry. It's not on the market yet. Um, so, in a way, this is like a historical document. People will look back on this film maybe in 10 years and go, whoa, interesting. Hopefully now everyone's going, whoa, interesting. But it will become, I think, increasingly relevant when we can look back on something like this and say that was the genesis phase of something game changing.
It's so cool because we're familiar with images of people eating, and there's a language that exists around that. But in this film, what is being consumed is so historic, and you must have had moments of vertigo as a filmmaker, being like, wow, I'm really capturing something that really can kind of only happen once, this sort of aha moment. Maybe as we're kind of running out of time, maybe one last question. You know why now? The they haven't succeeded yet, and yet you can't necessarily keep continuing for 5 years. It'd be amazing to have the first Memphis Meats products going out into the grocery stores. How did you know when to end the film in a moment when the industry itself is still in its infancy.
Well,
And will you miss your characters when they're done, because the story is still so in progress?
yeah. Well, thank God for deadlines. So there was a deliverable and a deadline with my broadcaster here in Canada with Documentary Channel. But I also knew it was time to wrap up the story. Otherwise, you just keep going and going. And then where would we be? We would be locked in COVID. And how do we, it was like incredible that we were able to finish when we did, which was the fall of 2019, complete the editing, complete all the pieces and, the marathon that is involved in making a film and completing a film, and then releasing it during this pandemic. How interesting is that? It's tragic in one way because this film, we should be traveling with this film. We should be out in the world with this film, having Q&As in person. You and I should be sitting on a stage right now after the film was just shown to a room full of people, having this discussion. Anyways, however, it is a very timely film for a subject like this. And, we're running out of time here, like you said, but, if you Google zoonotic disease, that is what COVID-19 is. And that is, disease that is spread from animals to humans. And, I will just end by saying that this food innovation could be the answer to could prevent the next health pandemic.
Thanks so much for that. So I wish we could keep talking, but it's really a fascinating film and profile, and it was just such a pleasure to get to speak with you. This concludes our interview with Liz Marshall. Thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you.